All right, let's take our Bibles tonight. Turn to the book of Ruth, chapter number 1. I think I just broke some. Ruth, chapter number 1. We're going to take a look here at a passage of Scripture that is going to be dealing with what is called tough love. Got a great passage lined out, tremendous example. And I think a couple of reasons why this is called tough love is, first of all, most people will not do it. They won't give it. They're afraid of hurting somebody's feelings. They're afraid of saying or doing something that will cause that friendship to shut down. And right now we're living in a day and a time when too many parents are afraid of their kids because they're not willing to give tough love. Parents are wanting a relationship with children that can be enjoyed when those kids grow up. That's when friendship kicks in. But when the kids are still kids, they need to be told what to do. They don't always have to be told why. And a lot of parents, they're harming their kids because they refuse to give their kids tough love. The other side of the coin is another reason why tough love is not all that common is if you think it's hard to give, it's hard to receive. And because of that, a lot of people, especially parents, are not willing to risk this. So we're going to get into an example, a great example of what tough love is all about, what it looks like and that sort of thing. Up to this point, Naomi and her husband made a horrible decision. They hit the panic button. They left Bethlehem, where they had been living all of their lives, more than likely. They went to a heathen country, Moab, because a famine had hit the Bethlehem area. They didn't know if they could survive this thing, so they headed off into Moab, and there they ran into a lot of disasters. Her husband passed away. Her 2 sons passed away after they'd married a couple heathen women. Ruth is one of these Moabite women. Naomi has been trying to get rid of her, and Ruth is not having anything to do with that. Verse number 16 is where we'll start reading. And there it says, "And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so unto me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." When she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left speaking unto her. So they two went until they came to Bethlehem, and it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them, and they said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said unto them, "Call me not Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. I want to bring a message tonight on the subject, when it's time to face the music. Where in the world did that phrase ever come from? It's time to face the music. There are some who believe that it came from a military custom when a person was dishonorably discharged and kicked out of the army. The first recorded incident in this nation took place during the Revolutionary War. There was an army officer by the name of Lieutenant Frederick Inslin who was charged with homosexuality. He was court-martialed, found guilty. He was drummed out of the army on the orders of General George Washington. the entire regiment was called to attention. That soldier was then forced to march past the regiment and out of the fort, being told never to return. During the Civil War, when a soldier was drummed out of the army for a dishonorable discharge, a band would begin to play the tune of Rogue's March. While the music was being played, the soldier was then stripped of their rank and marched out of the fort. Another possible beginning to the phrase of facing the music was the practice of separating the Jews who were being shipped off to concentration camps during World War II. As railroad cars would pull into the concentration camp, the doors were opened up. The Jews were horrified, not knowing what to do, what to expect. As the Jews were unloading from the boxcars, a Gestapo officer was pointing them in one of two directions. The old, the feeble, and the sickly were told to face toward the orchestra that was playing. There was an orchestra that was playing music that was to calm them down, to make them feel like they were home. And that orchestra was used to point certain individuals toward those buildings. They thought that they were supposed to be getting a shower, deloused. That's where the gas chambers were. When they were told to face the music, it was not something that was good. And therefore, this phrase has come to mean having to face circumstances that we've been holding off, putting off, having to face the consequences of something that we have done, always viewed as not a good thing. That is what is now happening to Naomi. She knew that she and her husband had done wrong back when they left Bethlehem years prior. They were supposed to have stayed there and trusted God. They decided not to do that. And so they packed up what belongings they could, grabbed their family, and headed off to Moab. And as they were doing so, they knew that it was not the right thing. And now Naomi is ready to go back home. The problem is she's lost everything. Her husband died. Her two sons grew up in Moab. They're dead now. She's got two heathen daughters-in-law that are wanting to go back to Bethlehem with her. She doesn't want to have a thing to do with that, so she's been trying to talk them into staying. One of them did, went back to her gods, just like Mom told her to do. But Ruth is refusing. She's willing to do anything and everything to go with Naomi. And now Naomi is ready to head back home, stuck with Ruth. Let's take a look at verse number 16. Some things that are going to come to pass as Naomi is having to face the decisions of a past. The first one is this: facing the music involved conviction. Verse 16, and Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest, I will go. And where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. The whole point about this matter of facing the music has to do with the fact that we know better. That's why we have to face up to this. Naomi knew when she and her husband packed their belongings and their 2 sons that they were running scared and they were supposed to stay in Israel. They knew that. They knew that they were trusting a heathen nation and refusing to trust God to take care of them. And for more than a decade, they tried to push those feelings of conviction to the back of their minds. But then came a renewed effort on God's part that it was time. Time for what? It's time to face the music. Remember what happened after David's affair with Bathsheba? For 1 year, David and Bathsheba tried to convince themselves that all was well. She was pregnant. They're going to have a baby. And the whole city was probably putting on the facade that everybody was happy, when so many knew that this was not right. And for 1 year, David shoved those feelings of conviction to the back of his mind. Almost gone. And then out of nowhere, Nathan shows up. And he starts telling the king about this story of a rich guy that steals a poor man's lamb. Too cheap to go out and buy one. That lamb was like a pet to the poor man. David, when he heard this story, he was so furious at what took place, not even realizing that he was the object of the story. And then the hatchet fell when Nathan said, "Thou art the man." David was crushed because all of those feelings of conviction came flooding back over his mind and his heart. And David had to face the music. And he spent the rest of his life dealing with the consequences of what he had done 1 year prior. When it's time to face the music, I'll tell you what God's going to do is He's going to rekindle that conviction. You see, we're good at sweeping things under the rug, but God knows what's under the rug. And He knows how to remove that rug. And there's going to come a time when God's going to say, "You know what? I've waited long enough. We've put this off long enough. It's time to face the music." Well, how do you know when that time has arrived? Conviction. It'll come roaring back. What God is doing is He's letting us know we need to take care of this. Verse number 16 again. Second thing that took place as Naomi is being brought into this very uncomfortable position. Number 2 is this: facing the music involved being pressured to do right. And Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." Ruth is here getting spiritual on Naomi. She's bringing up God. That's not what Naomi had ever done. Naomi had become so worldly and backslidden, God was not coming out of her lips very often. And yet, as Ruth is continuing to plead to be able to go back home with her, God is using Ruth to bring him into the equation. And now here is a Moabite woman telling Naomi, I'm going to convert from my false gods, and your God is going to become my God. She wasn't just saying that she wanted to go with her. What Ruth was telling Naomi was, I want to be just like you. I want your God to become my God. Can you imagine how Naomi must have felt? To have Ruth saying, I want to be just like you, when Naomi knew that she was not right. She was so far from God. How in the world could Ruth want to be like Naomi when Naomi didn't even like Naomi? Naomi also knew that the real reason why she was going back to Bethlehem was not for spiritual reasons at all. She was not going back to make things right with God. She was going back because there was nowhere else to go. And then came Ruth, asking to be taken back with Naomi, who in Ruth's mind was such a good Christian. This reminds me of why God used Samson as one of his judges. Samson was as worldly as could be. He was a womanizer. And yet God blessed him with supernatural strength. Samson was not doing right most of the time, and yet God chose to use him as a judge in Israel for 20 years. Well, why? If Samson was such a worldly person, why in the world would God use such a man? And the tragic answer is, because there wasn't much to choose from. Samson was pitiful, but he was still better than most. What a condemnation on the men of that era. Naomi was a backslidden Jew. She and her husband ran out on God because her faith was weak. She wasn't anything close to being spiritual, and yet, even in her horrible condition, Naomi was still head and shoulders above the rest of the people in Moab. She wasn't much, but God still used her to bring about a desire in Ruth to want to be saved. Even though her spiritual light was pretty dim, it was still bright enough to cause Ruth to want what she had in her life. And what she had was a belief in Jehovah God. And shockingly, Ruth was now willing to commit herself to him. Verse number 18. Let me throw this out just for a second. The goal of this message is not so that we can gain a historical view of what took place. That's pure background. What we're looking for more than anything else is application. What took place in this story that needs to take place in my life? That's what we need to be looking for. Third thing tonight is this. Facing the music involved silence. When she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she, Naomi, left speaking unto her. This is actually one of the smartest things that Naomi did in the entire episode. She knew Ruth was now demonstrating more character than she had. And she also knew that Ruth was right, and that she was willing to put her faith and trust in God as opposed to the false gods that she'd grown up with. When it comes time to dealing with things from our past that are unpleasant, it is often best to say as little as possible and leave it at that. Let me throw out a piece of advice for parents who still have kids at home. Your kids don't need to know everything about your past. They need to know what's in the Bible, biblical principles. They don't need to know everything about your past. Silence is how that's achieved. When Naomi came to the realization that she was not going to shake Ruth, that's when she decided she had already said enough. The reason why this is such a great thing to do is because God was the one who was bringing this thing to pass. God is the one who was pressing the issue. And the more that Naomi would have said, the more she would have been taking a position against God. And there are so many things that we don't understand what's going on in our lives, and therefore when we run into certain issues that have to do with our past, best thing to do is leave it alone. 10 years sounds like a long time for Naomi to be brought to a position where she's going to have to face her past. But God's the one dredging this thing up. God's the one who won't leave it alone. God is the one who's kind of prompting and prodding and pushing Ruth to make a big deal out of going back to Bethlehem. For Naomi to have continued to speak to Ruth would have been putting her in a position where she was either negative or critical of God Himself. And therefore, she very wisely chose to keep quiet. I recently read an article on the biggest mistakes made by criminals. One of the biggest mistakes made is that of talking too much. When a person gets into trouble, the first thing they want to do is they want to give their side of the story. And what they usually and typically do is they start throwing out excuses, or else they vent their anger and frustration. And that is the same when it comes time for a person to face the music about some sort of a spiritual failure in their life. Perhaps for years they've been justifying their behavior to themselves. When it comes time to facing the music, many times they want to throw out excuses as to why they did what they did. A second thing that criminals are really, really bad about, talking, number one, and number two on the list was texting, which is the same thing. Justifying themselves, making excuses. This is one of the most common elements that you'll find in the book of Job. When Job's 3 friends showed up, as long as they were quiet, everything was okay. But when they started running their mouth, running down Job, when they started lecturing him, that's when Job began firing back, maintaining his innocency. And the more that he talked, the more that he defended himself. And the more that he defended himself, the guiltier that he looked to his 3 friends. And that is how the back and forth dialogue that takes up most of the book of Job seemed to go. And what did Job finally do to bring about the end of his nightmare? When God started speaking, Job got quiet. He had enough spiritual sense to know that he did not need to get into an argument with God. And so Job just kept quiet. When it's time to face the music, listen to the music and bite your tongue. Verse 19. Facing the music involved chastening. Verse 19, so they two went until they came to Bethlehem, and it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them, and they said, is this Naomi? As Ruth and Naomi packed up their possessions and headed back to Israel, they finally made it back to Bethlehem, which was Naomi's hometown. As they entered the town, they got a lot of stares and "who are you" kind of looks. And then the grapevine started buzzing with the latest gossip because Naomi was back. As word continued to spread, more and more people began gathering around Naomi to find out, where in the world have you been for the last 10 years? And who is that? Oh, there were a lot of questions being raised, a lot of uncomfortable situations. And a lot of former friends, I'm sure, ran up and hugged her and said, "Good to have you back." But when Naomi and Ruth was gone, the number one question was this: is this Naomi? Sure didn't look like her. Her voice sounded familiar. But boy, she has aged. She looks 10 years older than she really is. What happened to her? What exactly were they driving at? Is this Naomi? What exactly did they mean? There are a variety of ways that a person can grow old. One is to live in denial. This is the person who is going through a lot of plastic surgery to make sure that they don't look their age, and then they can still dress like a teenager, and they're fooling everybody, they think. And the truth of the matter is, there ain't nobody fooled but themselves. Another way of growing old is to postpone it. This is the person like Jack LaLanne who continues to celebrate birthdays, but they're smart enough to start eating right and exercising so that they can stay healthy as they grow older. Another common way of growing old is just to surrender. This is the person who has given up all hope of ever being able to be healthy, and they're living on pills and doctor's appointments. And then one other way to grow old is prematurely. And this is the one that we need to be careful about, because it has to do more with a matter of heart than anything else. There are some who will find themselves facing health issues because it's a part of God's will for their life. And their body is older than their heart is. they have aged, so to speak, health-wise prematurely. Not through any fault of their own, simply because this is what God has for them. Kind of like the Apostle Paul and the thorn in the flesh that was given to him. And then there are some who will age faster simply because they've made the mistake of trying to outrun God. And they continue to run into obstacles. They continue to have Him pull the rug out from under them. And this was the situation that Naomi found herself in. Oh, she looked a whole lot older than she really was, and the reason is because you get old fast trying to outrun God. She'd been on the run from God for 10 or more years now. She is almost unrecognizable. And as Naomi came back to town, I mean, everybody that was kind of her age, they had all gotten 10 years older. But when they saw her, their first thought was, whoa, what happened to her? And what was taking place was that God was using Naomi as a teaching aid to help those who had stayed in Bethlehem to realize that they had made the right decision. God was wanting them to get a good look at her because that's what happens when you don't trust me. And you try to outrun me. Because I will always track you down. And when I get a hold of you, I'm going to use you to help some other people to know what not to do. Those other people in Bethlehem, they too could have hit the panic button and slipped out of town in the middle of the night, but they chose to stay. And so God is using Naomi to show them, you done good. You stayed put. You trusted me. And now you can see what the world does to people who chase after the world. Because you're going to come back with a lot of mileage. Verse number 20. Circle the word bitterly as we come to it. Number 5 tonight, last thing. Facing the music involved an attitude. And she said unto them, call me not Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. We're now coming down to the game changer and where Naomi really blew it. Naomi had become a victim of her own attitude. She had become her own worst enemy. Because if she had only had a right attitude years ago, she would have resisted her husband's idea of leaving. She would have encouraged him to stay put and to get godly counsel. Oh, and by the way, wives are allowed to do that. If she would have had the right attitude when her husband died, she would have allowed the heartache to drive her back to Bethlehem with her 2 sons before they got married to these heathen, lost women. But she didn't have a right attitude for all of those years, which is why it's no surprise now to see that she had become very, very bitter. Where did that bitterness come from? She was mad at God. He refused to go along with her plans. He chastened them for leaving Bethlehem, and then he chastened them some more for staying in Moab. And he chastened them even further for marrying unbelievers. And the shame of the situation is that after all of that chastening, Naomi is now mad at God for ruining all of her plans. And how bad was her attitude? It was so bad that she was not even trying to hide it at all. That is a bad attitude. When her old friends run up and begin speaking with her, they called her Naomi, that name meaning pleasant. And she said, don't bother even calling me that anymore. Call me Mara, because Mara means bitter, and that's exactly what I am. I'm mad. I'm angry. And this highlights something that is very important about an attitude. And that is that the person with an attitude fully knows that they have an attitude. Right. They know. When a person has a bad attitude, it's not one of these things that everybody else in the world knows except for that one person. They know because they chose it. If you were to try to find the people who had the worst attitudes of all time, you will also find people who had an attitude about everything and everybody. Because a bad attitude just kind of corrupts the whole thing. Genghis Khan had a bad attitude toward anybody who stood in his way of conquering the world. And when he had to put in extra effort to conquer a city, he put his bad attitude on display. He had the ruling nobles that had just been conquered brought in to a banquet room. These ruling nobles who had dared to oppose him were then placed on the floor, wood placed on top of them, and then a huge crowd was brought in to celebrate. And the celebration ended up crushing those individuals to death. Genghis Khan had such a bad attitude toward anybody that would dare to oppose him. By the end of his life, he had wiped out 11% of the world's population. Pol Pot became the leader of Cambodia in 1975. He quickly revealed that he had a bad attitude toward the educated Cambodians in his nation. He immediately began a program of shifting that nation to a farming community with a poor working class. In order to bring it about, he forced people to leave their jobs in the city. They had to relocate and live in the country and work as hired hands on farms. And anybody that grumbled about it or didn't like it were eliminated. In 4 years, he exterminated 1.7 million people. In 4 years, he wiped out 20% of Cambodia's population. The point is that a bad attitude is not going to remain hidden. It is proud of itself because it thinks that it's right. And because of that kind of arrogance, it will speak its mind no matter who is listening. And that's where Naomi found herself as she made her way back to Bethlehem. She didn't care who heard it. She didn't care how many people knew about it. She was mad at God, and that was the end of it. Spiritually, she was so far gone that she cared nothing for her daughters-in-law, which is why she tried to get them to go back to their false gods. So what could she have done to have helped herself? The first thing that she lost was her willingness to trust the Lord. And it was that lack of faith that gave birth to a bad attitude. Because when she left God's will for her life on purpose, that's when a bad attitude was born. And it continued to grow day by day. So how can we guard ourselves from having a bad attitude? Let me give you 5 things real fast in closing, how to protect ourselves from a bad attitude. Number 1, a bad attitude likes to fight. When you find yourself always on edge, always ready to lash out, you're already nursing a bad attitude. Number 2, a bad attitude likes to justify its existence. There's no way in the world that a Christian can defend a bad attitude. And therefore, we need to realize when you're dreaming up excuses to justify a bad attitude, it's worse than you think. Number 3, a bad attitude refuses to be corrected. There's going to be a friend that's going to try to help you to see something, because we all have blind spots. And as an individual tries to help you with a bad attitude, be careful, because a bad attitude will not be corrected. Number 4, a bad attitude does not care about right or wrong. Number 5, last thing, a bad attitude is sinful. And the only way that it can be dealt with, it's got to be confessed in order to get fixed. Naomi has wasted the last 10 years of her life. She has justified her actions and the actions of her husband who knows how many times. She's made excuses as to why her sons were allowed to marry these Moabite women. She comes back angry and mad, but God's not going to leave her that way. And that's the great thing about God. We can give up on ourselves, but God will continue to chase us down, because there's something that He wants us to do that's very important. And that is to face the music. She will be better off because of it, but not yet. Right now, it's still painful. Right now, she's still blaming God. But the day is going to come when she is so grateful that she had enough sense to come back home. Let's bow for prayer. Father, would you please bless all of our folks here this evening. And Holy Spirit, I pray that you'd help us to be grateful that you will not allow us to remain sometimes in a bad place where we deliberately want to remain and we've chosen to go there. Father, thank you for chasing after the backslider. Thank you, dear God, for not giving up on us. And Holy Spirit, I pray that this evening you would allow us to realize we need to embrace those occasions when we have to face the consequences of what we have done. Bless each one of our folks here this evening. Our heads are bowed and our eyes are